Fred Woods has taught in the church educational system for the past 2 decades. In the past 7 years, he's been at BYU. The previous 5 years, he was at BYU Idaho, which was Rick's then, I guess. You're there. He's an expert in Mormon migration. For the past 2 summers, he has been a visiting professor at BYU Hawaii, which must have been a tough job, where he was doing research for a book he is co-authoring on the history of Lae on the island of Oahu. In 2002, he received the Richard L. Anderson Distinguished Research Award from the BYU Religious Education. And during the summer of 2001, he was a research and teaching fellow at the Mercantile Library for the Pierre Laclede Honors College at the University of Missouri in St. Louis, where he's, let's see, did I just read that right? Where he spent the summer of 2000 as a research fellow at the library studying the American West and the American transportation history. In 1999, Dr. Woods was the Wilkinson Research Fellow at the Mariner Museum in Newport News, Virginia. He has authored several books and many articles and is the editor and compiler of the Mormon Immigration Index. For any of you who do your genealogy, that's very useful, which is currently being used by family history centers throughout the world. He's the executive director of the Mormon Historic Sites Foundation. Dr. Woods is a native of Southern California and joined the church just prior to his 20th birthday. He served a mission in the Adelaide, Australia mission, received his BS in psychology and MS in international relations from BYU. Is that the Kennedy Center? Yeah. You're a Kennedy Center grad? Oh, good. And in 1991, he received a PhD in Middle Eastern Studies from the University of Utah. He's married to Joanna Merrill, and they're the parents of 5 kids and 1 grandchild. So I'll turn the time over to Dr. Woods. He asked me to announce that he's planning on going right up to the closing time, which is 10 to 1. If you have any questions, he said that he would stay after to answer whatever questions that you have. Okay, turn the time over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm grateful to be with you today. I realized there was another speaker assigned, and he's in Kenya, was not able to make it, but I'm thrilled for the opportunity. I want to thank Lynn for the intro, and thank you, Rick, for the prayer, and my family that is here supporting me, and several colleagues. Yes, 20 years ago, I received my master's degree in international relations from the Kennedy Center, so this is a nice time to celebrate. And I truly believe it was once said that the sin of ingratitude is a crime more despicable than revenge. And I owe the Kennedy Center. I think, as I think of David M. Kennedy, he is the epitome of the phrase, the Latin phrase, in the essentials let there be unity, in the non-essentials liberty, but in all things charity. What a diplomat and ambassador for the church. And so I'm just grateful to be here and appreciate the funding that the Kennedy Center has given me to conduct Mormon migration internationally. I also want to just point out I'm not the first person to deal with this topic. George Ellsworth, R. Lanier Britch, and others have done quite a bit with this. Don Cannon for many years has taught, that's seated in the front row here, the International Church, and Richard Cowan and David Boone and others have an interest in this field. And so I just want to mention that I'm trying to put a brick in the wall, but then there have been many that have laid a path before me. My interest in this topic of Mormon maritime migration occurred as a result of studying the Hebrew Bible. I did my dissertation on water in the Hebrew Bible. And anyway, when I finished my degree from the University of Utah, my dissertation, I started asking myself the question, if Latter-day Saints don't suffer from cultural myopia, and we talk about the trail, and my question that got me into this was, have we missed the boat? Because I realized that 90% of the saints that are coming to Zion are traveling by water. And so I switched fields about a decade ago and have tried to concentrate now on Mormon maritime migration. And so that's what launched me into this. Lynn mentioned this. Several years of my life was working with a great team doing the Mormon Immigration Index, which has 543 voyages coming to Zion from 1840 to 1890, augmented by 1,000 first-person accounts by the Latter-day Saints, typed word for word and in a folio searchable database so you can study various topics. And anyway, we're doing right now 1891 to 1925. We thought it was over by 1890. according to historians, and found out that we've now found over 2,000 voyages to America by Latter-day Saints, over 2,000 between 1891 and 1925. When we thought they had turned off the faucet, they hadn't. So anyway, today we're going to talk about some things. And why I got into this, wondering, have we missed the boat? Perhaps we could darken this a little bit, Emily. I'm thinking with the images up here, we can experiment a bit. Is that a little bit better? Is that okay right there? Okay, great. So the question is, have we missed the boat? I mentioned the Mormon Immigration Index, and what's fascinating about this is that only about 1% of those that gathered to America from the Pacific came, or only about 1% who gathered to America were from the Pacific. That's significant. There were other gathering places in the Pacific, and the cost, culture in part, and so that's why we're trying to capture now the story of the Pacific, and even though it's about 1%, it's still a very exciting story. So nearly all of the native Pacific converts gathered to local islands. And so why are the saints gathering at all? To escape persecution, be instructed by church leaders, strengthen each other. They felt America was a promised land, and to receive blessings of the temple, which did not occur for most of the Pacific converts until the 20th century. In 1983, we have the temple in Tahiti. And so I just wanted to give you this big picture before we launch our voyage today. You'll see this with the islanders, the Polynesians, as well as the British or Scandinavian converts. I love this phrase by Jane C. Robinson Hindley, where she talks about how difficult it was to come to Zion, but with the fire of Israel's God burning in my bosom, I forsook my home for the gospel's sake. And so whether they came to America or whether they gathered in different pockets together, it was this fire of the gospel of Jesus Christ that caused people to gather. The prophet Joseph Smith in 1831 made the statement that through the Lord, send forth the elders of my church unto the nations which are afar off, unto the islands of the sea. And he also mentioned, he said, don't let a single corner of the earth go without a mission. I think that's very significant, and this year when we celebrate the 200th anniversary of his birth, that he was a global thinker, and he wanted to take the gospel of Jesus Christ to the ends of the earth. You see the determination in these missionaries, and they were taking it in various places. You can see these sea routes that they were taking and bringing in their converts. We'll be talking today about this area in the Society Islands, which is part of French Polynesia. Very fascinating accounts are on this Mormon Immigration Index that talk about deliverance at sea, both going to the mission field as well as bringing converts back, that I would alert you to as you look at the index. And I want to point out that at the time that we have voyages, nearly 5,000 British converts coming to Nauvoo in the early 1840s, we also have missionaries being sent forth. So the call comes in May of 1843, and they actually departed on Brigham Young's birthday. We have these four missionaries, Addison Pratt, Benjamin Groward, Noah Rogers, and Knowlton Hanks. Pratt is an interesting guy. Doesn't he look like a whaler? Pratt was a very interesting person. I have a copy of his patriarchal blessing. He's from the tribe of Zebulon, which is interesting because they're associated with a seafaring people. He served a mission to French Polynesia from 43 to 48. He came back and instructed the elders in Tahitian in the winter, so December of 48 and the early part of 49, and then would later return with his family to French Polynesia. So he had experience as a mariner early in his life and went to Hawaii for several months, and he had this yearning desire to return. This is Benjamin Groward. At 14, he left his home and went to sea. He served for nearly 9 years in French Polynesia and was another one of these first missionaries that went. Noah Rogers was the oldest. He was the leader of the mission, and also has a very interesting life. I might just note here that in the end of May in 1846, as he was coming from Nauvoo with his family, crossing the plains, he died and is buried at Mount Pisgah. Knowlton Hakes is the only bachelor among the group. He suffered from consumption, which we know today as tuberculosis. He dies 3 weeks out after they left from New Bedford, Massachusetts. And I think this is an interesting note here from Mrs. Frances Pratt Dyer, the daughter of Addison Pratt. She explains why this happened. She said one day in conversation with President Young in Nauvoo, they commenced to talk about those islands. Remember, Addison Pratt had spent 6 months in Hawaii on one of his trips. Pratt expressed a strong desire to revisit them. Brother Brigham asked him if he would be willing to be sent there on a mission. He said he would if he could have others sent with him. Hanks was raptured with the descriptions Brother Pratt gave on the islands and risked his life going to see and hope that he would reach a land that would be much easier on him with the condition that he had. So this is the early roots of this. So they left from Nauvoo. And just to say something about their spouses, I know I wouldn't get very far without my sweetheart Joanna. Sister Rogers took care of 9 children while Noah served on a mission. And I think that should be mentioned. Louisa Barnes Pratt left with 4 daughters. She would return with her husband after he returned on his first mission, and they would bring their family. This is an interesting quote. She said, "Never had such a thought entered my mind that he would be sent to a foreign land." He was actually called to Vermont, but they switched the mission call. "Our property was invested in land in the state of Indiana, and there was no ready means to be left for my support with 4 young children, all daughters. The saints were poor. She said, I must paddle my own canoe." I like that line. "I determined to trust in the Lord and stand bravely before the ills of life and rejoice that my husband was counted worthy to preach the gospel." So they were set apart in the 70s hall, and I think this is a nice piece as well. A week before he leaves, we have this record in the history of the church. Addison Pratt presented the tooth of a whale, coral bones of an albatross wing, and skin of a foot, jawbone of a porpoise, and tooth of a South Sea seal as the beginning for a museum in Nauvoo. I went through and searched for this with the help of a staff member. We did not find this, but we found 1,927 Polynesian artifacts that are, kind of like the Raiders of the Lost Ark, are kind of stowed away somewhere. And that was an interesting adventure, and we're hoping with time that those artifacts can be displayed rather than just telling the story of the saints coming to Salt Lake with Joseph and Brigham. It's very important, but the international story, which would certainly include the Pacific. Departure. Noah Rogers talks about leaving on the first day of June. As I said, Brigham's birthday. They left on the steamship Mary. We've now identified over 150 steamboats that transported Latter-day Saints with this migration in the mid-19th century. And they arrived in New Bedford. Now this was, if you wanted to go to a whaling area, this was the bullseye, okay? This was the bullseye, and they have a wonderful whaling museum in New Bedford. I presented a lecture on this topic in October to a bunch of whalers. They have an annual conference, and we had a lot of fun. They had never had a Mormon lecture to them on something like this, and it was a very fun experience. So they arrive in September of 1843. And as I said, this is a very prosperous whaling town at the time. And here we have an image of the whale oil preservation. So a brief history. I'm not going to get way down on this. The thing I want to emphasize is at the time they arrived, there was a population of 12,000 in New Bedford, Massachusetts. And also point out that it seems to me rather coincidental that on the exact day that Addison Pratt arrived to make arrangements to go on the whaling ship Timoleon, that there was on the front page of the paper a story about the Mormon prophet Joe Smith. And I think that's an interesting point. I found this city directory for 1841, and it listed these various churches. We're going to see that there were two families later that went on this voyage with these whalemen. One family from the Baptist Church, another a Universalist, the Winslow and Lincoln families. And even though there were 100 Latter-day Saints in a branch at this time, by the time they left in 43, there's no mention of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in the city directory. There was a nice man in the town by the name of Butler that was a member of the Society of Friends, a Quaker, that allowed them to use this old building to meet in. So we have these different reports showing 96 members, another report of 100 members by September of 43 when they leave. However, by April of 44, we only have 60 saints living in New Bedford. Why? Because the missionaries are going out and gathering them, saying, come home to Zion, come into Nauvoo. And so it will reduce the branch by 40%. So, change of plans. The missionaries could not get a voyage to the Sandwich Islands, so they made the decision to launch their efforts to the Society Islands, as they had heard that the whale ship Timoleon would be embarking on a voyage that would bring the vessel to this area. A little bit about the Timoleon. I'm not going to bore you with the detail that maybe I would talk about at Mystic Seaport or the San Francisco Maritime Museum. But I will mention this, that it's not clear what the name of the ship is derived from, but Timoleon was a Greek statesman and a general of Corinth, and Greek in Timo means honor and Leon means lion. So that'll give you a little bit for your Gee Whiz file. David Montgomery, that I had as a teacher for Near Eastern Studies 20 years ago, used to always talk about the Gee Whiz file. In other words, it's not that important, but for those of you that are really curious. So Pratt writes this interesting line for the times and seasons that I think is a wonderful saying. The Timoleon is an excellent seaboat, but not a fast sailor. She makes short passages, but not quick ones. And I found this image. This is a scrimshaw whale tooth, and it's hard to see. There's actually, it's carved here, the Timoleon. Courtesy of the New Bedford Whaling Museum, I was excited to see this image to get an idea what the vessel was like. Well, payment for the voyage. In this church conference, Brigham Young goes back to Boylston Hall in Boston. There's 878 members coming from the east, gathered in, and he asks a question, can you do something for these men that are going to the Pacific? And specifically, he calls on Elder Megan and also Elder Philip B. Lewis to fit them out. And eventually Lewis will respond to that call. And he comes up with $300 for the trip. Interestingly enough, later he'll be the mission president on the Sandwich Islands that Pratt wanted to return to. Groward writes, we had not one half enough money to pay our passage, and we had no clothing nor any means of getting any neither. Did we know from whence our required help was coming? But we trusted in the Lord. While waiting in this state of hope and anxiety, wondering from what source the Lord would send us the help he had promised us, Brother Philip B. Lewis, a member of the NB branch, New Bedford branch of the church, came to us. He told us to give ourselves no more uneasiness, as he would see that our passage was paid, and we provided with all we stood in need of to make us comfortable on our passage. One of the wonderful things is, of the 4 missionaries that went on this mission, 3 of the 4 kept a journal. The 4th one, Knowlton Hanks, that dies 3 weeks into the voyage, is the only one that didn't keep a journal. So we're able to weave this tapestry. I would be amiss again in not mentioning that S. George Ellsworth has published the journals of Addison Pratt. And that was a very important document to launch with some of this other research. And as I mentioned earlier, Professor R. Lanier Britch with Under the Islands of the Sea has done a lot of work with these going into the Pacific. So here's Lewis. He's from Marblehead. I don't know if you've ever been to Marblehead. Driving in Marblehead, the streets are so narrow that you need to slick down, put some polish on the side of your car. But again, he's coming from the east. He's a Massachusetts guy and plays an important role in all of this. The missionaries are deceived in their purchase of their fare. This is interesting from Groward's journal again. When Pratt made the purchase for our passage, the owner, whose name is Lawton, and I did some research and found out this is Asa T. Lawton, told him that as other passengers were going, the room would be entirely occupied. But if we would take our passage in the forecastle, that's in the front of the ship, among the sailors, that's important, we could go, but he would make no reduction of our fare. We learned after we got to sea that he had lied most basely to us. The cabin passengers paid the same price as we did, and while we were cooped up in a small place 7 by 9, 4 of us in number, and fed on the very coarsest of seafare, having to wait on ourselves, they had plenty of room and good food, and 2 or 3 to wait on them, so they were ripped off. But it turns out to be a blessing for them, as you will see. So here's Lawton, a little bit of background on him. We know that in 1843, the Timoleon's manager, owner, or agent was Joseph Dunbar, who was assisted by this Lawton character. And we know from the New Bedford Daily Mercury, we know when the ship cleared on the October 9th, 1843. And we also know where Lawton lives and a little bit about him that I won't get into today. Now, this guy was a character. He was an alcoholic. He looks like a gentleman, but do not be deceived. A very serious drinking problem. This comes out with consul records from Tahiti, National Archives, where at the end of the voyage he can't even handle coming back. But one of the mariners has to take the ship back because he's inebriated, and he has been for most of the voyage on and off, and kind of had a major problem with drinking. But if you take away the alcohol, educated, culturally refined, but the alcohol made a bit of a brute out of him. So he's from Nantucket, Captain William Plask. We have different accounts of Plask. For example, in January of 44, Pratt will indicate our captain is a man who possesses much nobleness of soul, but his manners and habits have become very unsteady through an intemperance use of alcohol. But when he is himself, he is quite full of sport and pastime. 3 months later, the captain, the second mate, and one of the boat steerers got so drunk they could hardly take care of themselves. This day I got the first insult from him, the captain, that he had been pleased to bestow upon me, though he had not been pleased to deal them out to most of the passengers and crew. Long ere this, they were generally with the least provocation, as was this case. The following day, the captain gave me a pressing invitation to accompany him on shore, but the sensations I received from his ungentlemanly conduct I declined. Addison Pratt. May 9th, Captain Plaskett made me presents of several articles, Addison Pratt writes, that are of much service to me, and told the king of Tibuwa that if he did not use or treat me well when he returned, he would redress my wrongs. I took leave of them. They went on board and were soon out of sight. On the 31st of May, he writes, Captain Plaskett, when he took leave of me, told the natives through his linguist that if they did not use me well and see that I wanted for nothing when he returned with his ship, he should take me away from them and come home. This has put them under much fear of losing me, and this, though quite unexpected from Captain Plaskett, is quite to my advantage. They seem to be quite anxious to retain a missionary among them. So Tibuwa is 350 miles south of Tahiti, so they come in on this island, and they're begging for a Christian missionary, and so he feels prompted by the Spirit that he should remain, and the others went on to Tahiti. What about the description of the crew? This to me is fascinating by Groward. Our situation on board the ship was anything but pleasant, and there was no prospect of any change for the better. The captain was one of these self-important men who because he had command of a ship and a few sailors, felt as though he was an absolute monarch of the whole world. And we learned from this article below from the friend from Honolulu, published from Honolulu, the American consul at Tahiti has sent home the American ship Timoleon under the command of Mr. Brown, sailing master of the U.S. brig Perry, on account of the drunkenness of the master of said ship. And there's also some interesting records going back and forth that the National Archives has. This is the letter. The unpleasant duty is devolved upon me of depriving Captain Plaskett of his command, writes Chapman, and the circumstances under which she arrived has obliged me to send her home to her unfortunate owners, with, I fear, at least a loss of $20,000. It's a lot of money, particularly at that time. Complaints were made of brutal treatment on the part of the captain, who was represented to be constantly in a state of intoxication, totally unfit for the transaction of business necessary for expediting the departure of the ship. and whenever upon deck are able to leave his cabin, are a stable bordering upon insanity, abusing with the most gross obscene language his officers and crew, making use of weapons by which the lives of one or two of his crew has been seriously endangered. And threats were made against the life of Dr. Winslow, which is one of these two families that went aboard with the crew. So here is the abstract log of the Timoleon from New Bedford, giving you an idea of where they went and how much oil they were able to bring back. I've extracted here from the National Archives. Description of the crew and the passengers by Groward. The officers were not gentlemen, neither did they know what belonged to good manners. The crew were a mixture of good and bad. Part were old sailors. I actually have a copy of the passenger list. 29 members. They average, he's saying old sailors. I think this is meaning experience because the ages listed of the 29 men are from age 16 to 28, although not all of them are listed, so that might explain this other point. Some had run away to escape. Some were old sailors, part were farmers' sons. Some had run away to escape punishment for their crimes. And others were seeking their fortunes, but take them together, they were much better than the captain and officers. Our passengers consisted of a Dr. Winslow, his wife, servant, and 3 children. Mr. Lincoln and his wife all destined for Tahiti, seeking their fortunes. Dr. Winslow in religion was a Unitarian, as also was his wife. Mr. Lincoln and wife were Baptists and appeared to be an honest couple. The doctor's wife, I think, was also an honest woman, but a great lover of that which is an abomination in the sight of God. Popularity. Okay. So we have, as I said, the Timoleon crew member register for this voyage contains the names of William Plaskett, master of 29 crew members, all between the ages of 16 and 28. Incidentally, if you can't find your ancestor in the Mormon Immigration Index, it may be because they worked their way back, and therefore they're not classified as a passenger, but rather they are a crew member, so you must check the crew member list, and if you do, you'll probably strike gold. So I mention that to you because that's an important point if you cannot find your ancestor that's coming back, immigrating to America in the 19th century. Passengers on board. So here we have Winslow, this physician and scientist who's corresponding with Michael Faraday, encouraging further study of the atom, a very bright guy. He actually, even though he didn't join the church, he really liked these Mormons and ends up moving to Salt Lake City, where he died in 1873. So that's the Winslow story. As far as the other family, the Lincolns, remember there's just these 2 families, the 29 crew members, Plaskett, and 4 missionaries, but 1 die. Groward writes, I have lived with Brother Lincoln ever since I have been here, meaning in Tahiti. Both he and Sister Lincoln treat me as one of their own family. They want me to stay with them as long as I am here. Seth Lincoln was ordained an elder and became the branch leader in Tahiti when Groward went to Tibuwa to assist Addison Pratt. That was having success where he had baptized 60 of the 200 natives on this island. So he's going to help them out and to help regulate the church and things. So this to me is fascinating, again, which really demands further study, not only with Latter-day Saints, but the influence that Christian missionaries have on mariners and other passengers, whether they're going to the mission field or returning. So that's a point I want to make that I think is really important. Another thing I want to mention is I've been doing study, as was mentioned earlier by Len, and Laie. And what I've been using are Protestant mission records, the ABFCM, the American Board for Foreign Missions. And we don't have a lot of history of what's going on between 1857 and 1864 when the missionaries are called home before they return. And so what I've been using is those Protestant missionary records to fill in the gaps of what takes place with Mormon history. Another thing I'm trying to do right now is to get funding to go to London because I found that the London Mission Society that we'll be talking about, there's a rich archive there. And I have a feeling that between 1852, when these missionaries pull out, and 1892, that 40-year period, where we don't have much history of what's going on at all, that again, if we look at the London Mission Society, they will be talking about the Mormons just like we have the records of the Protestants in Hawaii talking about the same thing. So this is something I'm excited about, and I just mentioned to you as the next step of how do we tell this story in some of the detail. Preaching on board. This is fun to me. Here we have Pratt. Preaching is not sanctioned by the captain, therefore our teachings are rather of a private character. Yea, verily. April 12th. Made application to the captain for the privilege of preaching to the crew. His answer was, if we get a fair wind, I will see. So we have to be dependent on the winds for an opportunity to declare the glad tidings of salvation in a public manner to the ship's crew. As Doyle Green wrote, I think this captures it well, during those 203 days, this is nearly 7 months with these salty whalemen, during these 203 days which they spent on board the ship, the missionaries were not permitted to do any public preaching, but they spared no effort to strike up private conversations with individual passengers and members of the crew. Mormon influence on the crew. This is Pratt again, February of 44. He writes, I have said but little as yet about the progress of religion among the crew. Though our privilege among them is uncontracted, still there is some encouragement. The second mate told me today he believed and intended being baptized, and most of the men in the forecastle, now remember, they were ripped off and so were stuck in the front of the ship with the sailors, but look how it turns out to be a blessing here. And most of them in the forecastle have come, it should be underlined in bold, have come under penalty of a pound of tobacco fine if they use profane language. This is a law they made among themselves, and among them there are many hopeful cases. Isn't that incredible that they made their own rule to nail each other if they swore with these Mormon boys? Now, I've had some time I've spent, my dad was in the Navy for one thing, but with some mariners, and in fact, I sailed across the North Sea a few years ago with some Norwegian sailors, and when I was being trained as a crew member, and one time I blew it. It was raining, and knowing the ropes is very important. And I know one of them was swearing at me in Norwegian, but I didn't quite get the details. Anyway, they were cleaning up for him. These changes have been brought about by private conversations and lending books and marking passages in their Bible. And then we have, this is very nice, 3 days later, received a present, new striped shirt from Mr. Thompson, the second mate. Said we were preaching without hire and we deserved something. Okay, I think that's significant. Pratt, a former whaler himself, describes a vivid account of the crew chasing whales. He just couldn't resist writing this in his own account. This morning saw a whale breach off the lee quarter. We tacked ship and stood for the place. Soon discovered a shoal of sperm whales. We ran the ship quite near them and lowered 4 boats. The fourth mate's boat got in among them and harpooned one first. His crew then beckoned the others' boats by swinging their hats. This sight was frightfully grand. So he didn't get it out of his system. To see the ocean crimsoned for some distance around and the whales sprouting up blood and lashing the ocean with their fins and flukes till the water was in a bloody foam. I never saw whales so docile before. If the weather had been clear, I think they would have killed nearly all the whales in the shoal, but it was very raining and foggy. Addison Pratt. Just showing you, depicting. This was tough work, folks. Some of you have, or maybe most of you read Moby Dick. All right. So this is just showing you where Knowlton Hanks is buried at sea, as I said, 3 weeks out. And this was a very sober day, as Groward writes in his journal. We had one source of grief and anxiety which was greater than all the rest, to lose one of our small number and burying him in the ocean, which was heartrending to us. A very heavy weight was attached to his feet, which would doubtless sink him far below the region of sharks, and probably preserve him entire until he shall come forth closed upon with immortality. His death caused a vacancy that we felt sorely throughout the whole mission, but we felt to say, Thy will, O Lord, be done. When I was back in New Bedford doing research last year, I found an 1843 booklet that described, by the way, published in New Bedford, the very year they left, that describes in detail exactly what's supposed to occur at the time of when someone is consigned to the deep. the Psalms that were read, different scriptures. One was John, I remember 11:25. I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. So there was a set pattern that was read. And this was a very sober time. We felt sorely through the whole mission, but we felt to say, Thy will, O Lord, be done. Her generous crew gathered around and with uncovered heads, Pratt writes, listened in breathless silence to a very appropriate prayer, which was made by Brother Noah Rogers. He was the oldest, so he was presiding over this group. Then they gently raised the end of the plank till the corpse slid off and struck in the water feet foremost. And I love this last line. As he sank, my eyes followed him in a white speck, which vanished in the blue waters below. Knowlton Hanks. This is just depicting that, maybe even more than your Gee Whiz file. There was a group of 10 of us that did an article in 1998 for the Ensign where we were asked to respond to the question of how many deaths crossing the plains and crossing the ocean, different parts of the migration experienced by sail, rail, and trail. I had the sail portion from 1840 to 47 to 68, and I counted 670 deaths. Although it's fascinating to me that out of over 500 voyages that launched from Liverpool, we didn't lose one single vessel crossing the Atlantic, and only one in the Pacific, and it was a miracle we only had 5 drown. They were rescued from the Scilly Islands, which is part of the Society Islands. It's kind of a Robinson Crusoe story where they lived on turtle eggs and things. But the Mormons have the best maritime record for immigration by far. And that's an important point, I think. Although we had people that measles might break out and various things happen with, of course, with Hanks, I said earlier, it was tuberculosis. So, private prayer. This was a tough thing. I mean, to be with this crew, you never had any privacy, and they were so happy once they reached St. Paul's Island after being out to sea for several months, and they finally got away after 4 months and had a chance to pray. If you've served a mission, you understand what it's like, how much you appreciate a bathroom with a locked door and being able to get on your knees and talk to the Lord about your companion. Of course, this never happened to any of you, right? Anyway, these experiences do occur. I will just mention that this Captain Cooper invites them to have a meal with him that they meet at this time. And some of you know the rest of the story of his life that we won't take time today. So here we go. First of all, they drop off a trap here in the Austral Islands on Tibuwa. And then we're going to see where later Noah Rogers will come into this area and has a lot of challenges. We'll see great success in this area by Benjamin Groward. We want to just kind of give you this big picture of French Polynesia and these different islands that these missionaries are going to. So isn't this a beautiful island? As I said, when the missionaries land, when Addison Pratt stays here, there were about a population of 200, and we had about 60 conversions with his presence there. 350 miles south of Tahiti, no missionaries on the island at the time. The inhabitants of Tibuwa wanted a missionary to stay with them, and so Pratt felt like he should be the one. Pratt's struggle with the language led to his first converts, which is, there's always a mixed blessing. There were some Americans on the island who were building a schooner by salvaging parts from a wrecked ship, who served as his interpreters on various occasions, and they had learned the language, including his informal gospel discussions. And in time, 6 of these, 7 Americans joined the church, forming the nucleus of the Tibuwa congregation. I've actually seen they have in church archives up in Salt Lake City a list of the Tibuwa branch, and you have these names of these different 60 natives written, and it's really quite fascinating, dating back to 1844. First baptisms today, Pratt writes, preached to a very attentive audience. I felt much of the Spirit. The hearers were well pleased, so I heard. After service, I baptized and confirmed Ambrose Alexander. I hope his companions will soon follow. So one of these seamen, American seamen. Pratt also writes, after the morning service, I gave an invitation to all those who felt in their duty to be baptized to present themselves at a place appointed on the beach, and I would wait on them. The multitude assembled there came forward, and I baptized. And then he lists a number of these seamen that were baptized. A letter from Pratt to his wife, he says, I doubt not but what you will say, now my husband has got the desire of his heart when I tell you, the first 6 persons I have adopted into the kingdom by baptism are sailors. And perhaps you ask, did you hammer the rust off them any? I will answer, could you see them on their knees and hear their humble petitions, you would say, there has been a great change wrought somehow. I cannot express the heart-filled gratitude that came over me when I saw the tears of penitence trickle down their sea-worn faces, Pratt writes, nor the warm emotions that vibrated my heart while I heard them thank the Lord that I had been casually thrown upon this island and had become the humble instrument in his hands of bringing them to see their lost condition, from one salt to another. Pratt's letter to Brigham Young, he describes the baptisms at this time on Tibuwa. 57 persons, he says. Among them are the queen, a deputy king, etc. And then he says, jestingly, I am prime minister of the island. I often tell them I did not come here to make laws or to see them executed, but to preach the gospel of our Lord and Savior. But I am not allowed to rest here, and so I have to do the best I can. You know, always pestering him for advice among these people. I thought this was interesting, too. Pratt is comforting a native nearing death who asks, what is to become of me? I have been a warrior and a man of blood, said I. You did it in a time when you were swallowed up in heathenish superstition and ignorance. Now your trust must be in him whose blood is able to cleanse you from all your sins. And now do not let your mind waver, but place your hope and faith on him, and he will lead you safely to that blissful abode of eternal rest. I left him, and in a few days he died without any kind of sickness. So this is a powerful thought, I think. Church services, I would just note there that they're really following the Protestants' style of things as far as their meetings. And we need to make tribute. I appreciate Dr. Britch, who in his book Unto the Islands of the Sea talked about these early Protestant missionaries and their efforts, the London Mission Society and others, and their efforts to try to bring Christianity. I mean, by the time that these guys show up in Tahiti, they already have translated the Bible by 1835. And so, in a way, it was a mixed blessing again, because they had this platform for us to launch missionary work, but at the same time, they didn't want the Mormons treading on their territory. Daniel Mackenzie of New Bedford and crew of the Caroline visited Tibuwa. They had talked to this Dr. Winslow who went on to Hawaii, and he says, you need to go back and visit with this guy Pratt on Tibuwa. And so he did visit with him for several days, and he noted that this captain was a religious man. We investigated the Latter-day work considerably. He was much pleased with it, said it was the most like the gospel of Christ of any creed he had yet heard of, and he was determined on investigating the matter more fully. So, Pratt stays on Tibuwa. And we have Rogers and Groward going on to Tahiti. And at this time, it was an interesting the political climate. We had some missionaries that were from the London Mission Society that had penetrated and were influencing the government. And to make a long story short, the French had sent in several Catholics in the 1830s, and the natives didn't like having their influence there, so there was a war that was going on between the natives and the French. And out of that, though, what resulted is by 1842, the French had issued a document for religious toleration. So by the time they slipped in 1844, they were able to benefit from that. Or if the British would have been in control at the time, it would have created some problems for their preaching. But that would soon change, and by 1850, they're running into all kinds of problems with the French that, in fact, by 1852, Their hands are so tied on not being able to travel to other islands, being officially recognized as ministers and being consigned to different districts, that they closed up the mission in 1852 and didn't reopen it for 40 years. So here we have a part of the Society Islands here coming to Tahiti. When Rogers and Groward arrived in Papeete, Tahiti, the city and island were in turmoil. The French were fighting the natives for control of the island. And as I said, the French government eventually ran the political affairs and initially allowed the LDS missionaries to preach. But by 1852, because of these conditions, I should say, they were forced to leave Tahiti. The London Missionary Society I mentioned came and paid the work. Their mission was to spread the knowledge of Christ among the heathen and other enlightened nations. They taught the native Tahitians English, translated the Bible into Tahitian, and abolished human sacrifice. So they did some good work there. As far as the first baptisms here, Ellsworth writes, the natives were interested only in ending the war and solving its accompanying problems. The English missionaries excluded the Mormons from the only church facilities and influenced the natives against them. In addition, the Americans had the time-consuming task of learning the Tahitian language. After the first baptisms, Tamolian passengers, Mr. and Mrs. Lincoln, fortunately enough, the next converts were among the white Tahitian-speaking population. Actually, it should be S. George Ellsworth there. Groward went to the docks of Tahiti, so as the sailors are coming in, he's teaching them, although his hands are tied because of these other issues. But he baptized several sailors that would come in and dock. And Groward and Rogers decide, because of the problems, to go different ways. Groward will have a lot of success. Rogers chooses to go to the Society Islands, but was forbidden to preach. And he hears of troubles in Nauvoo, so he actually returns home because he's worried about his family. And it's interesting to me that on his journey home, the captain allows him to preach on the Three Brothers, was the name of this image, or this vessel. And so he baptizes. The result, he says, were 7 or 8 believed, and 2 of them were baptized. One of them, this is a fascinating story in and of itself, one of them comes all the way from Philadelphia with him to Nauvoo by the name of Franklin Towers, this mariner. And what did they do with him? They actually made him to be a spy, and he would go down to Warsaw, and we know from the Journal of Hosea Stout, he would report on January 20th, 1846, he reports of what they're planning to do with the 12 and various things that are going on. And this, I think, has an impact on wanting to move the saints and have them leave by February the 4th. So this is very interesting to me, as you see, that Franklin, who had been sent as a spy to Warsaw, and it talks about the officers trying to attempt to arrest the 12. So this is, I think, a point that is not well known. So what about on Ana? Well, Groward says when he comes to the area, he hears this jabbering like a flock of 10,000 wild geese. And as he approaches the area, he says he hears this hallooing. And as he listened to these frightful noises and not being able to understand what they said, I knew not but what I had become a victim for sacrifice indeed, which is fascinating. So here is depicting this. But then he says this, to hear them calling upon the Lord, who but for a few years before were the most ferocious savage cannibals, and to hear them call to in the name of Jesus for God to roll forth, establish, and build up his latter-day work, it caused me more joy in my bosom than I can tell. Yes, but a few short years I have passed since their large double canoes manned with from 50 to 100 men, 15 and 20 in number, would return from the adjacent islands, loaded with the skulls of those victims which they had slain in battle and whose bodies they had eaten. So he's overcome with joy. It's beautiful. Where should we gather? On the 24th of September, 1846, the first Mormon conference was held on the island of Ana. 10 branches of the church, totaling 866 members. Many of them were anxious to go, Pratt will write, but said they could not for lack of means. Pratt writes to Brigham Young, when we speak to them about the gathering, he say, many of them, we are ready to go now, but how are we to get there? The only answer we can give is the Lord will open the way. It's interesting to me that 8 years later, a vessel was purchased in San Francisco for this purpose, but the cost of maintenance and outfitting was too much. And so they continued to gather there. I just want to conclude with this, that the missionaries drew very close together as they labored with each other, as we see here with Groward and with Pratt, who says, as they depart after serving several years together, I shall never forget the parting with Brother Groward. He and I have been yoked together in the mission for 3.5 years. We have withstood the frowns of poverty, the opposition of men and devils, the frowns of hunger, traveling over the sharp coral rocks and slippery mountains with our toes out of our shoes and our knees and elbows out of our clothes, living part of the time on coconuts and raw fish, and sleeping on the ground for the sake of obeying the Savior's commandments and preaching the gospel to the natives of the South Sea Islands. It's interesting, this last October, at the time that I was giving this presentation, the same month over in New Bedford, the Tahitian saints were celebrating the 160th anniversary of the gospel of Jesus Christ coming to the islands of the sea. Today there are over 20,000 Latter-day Saints in French Polynesia, of a population of about 262, which means that about 7.8%, or about 1 out of 13, is a Latter-day Saint who is associated with many local ecclesiastical units and a temple in Tahiti. Finally, I'd just like to say that I know that the hand of the Lord was on these missionaries, and I'm amazed at their sacrifices to leave their families for years to preach the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.